All right, let's dive into something that is absolutely fascinating and, always a little controversial: biblical archaeology. It's a field where you're part detective, part historian, and where a single clue dug out of the dirt can completely rewrite what we thought we knew about the past. But it's also a world where the line between a priceless artifact and a really clever fake can be razor thin. So let's get into it. And we're gonna start with a real bombshell. I'm sure you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They're legendary, seen as this incredible direct link to the ancient world. For decades, that's what we all thought. But what if I told you that a recent scandal has raised an absolutely shocking question? What if some of the most prized artifacts out there were actually modern fakes? Okay, but before we get into all the drama and the forgeries, it's super important to understand why the real scrolls were such a massive, world-changing discovery in the first place. So let's rewind and start with the authentic find that really changed everything. And look, this isn't just me hyping it up. Smithsonian Magazine calls it one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. That is not an exaggeration. This find was like opening a time capsule we never, ever thought we'd find. The whole story starts almost like a movie. Picture this. It's 1947. A young shepherd is looking for a lost goat, throws a rock into a cave, and hears pottery shattering. That single sound kicked off a decade-long treasure hunt. And what they found was just unbelievable. Thousands of ancient fragments tucked away in 11 different caves. And these weren't just any old texts. They were pieces of biblical books, other religious writings, and texts from this mysterious ancient community that lived there 2,000 years ago. To really get why this was such a game changer, think about it like this. Before these scrolls, the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible we had were from around the 10th century CE. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they were over 1,000 years older than that. It was a quantum leap back in time. All of a sudden, scholars could compare our modern Bible to versions that existed around the time of Jesus. It was absolutely revolutionary. Okay, so the whole world is celebrating this incredible discovery. But while all that's happening, a much darker story is starting to unfold in the background. And it's a story that would lead to one of the biggest scandals in modern archaeology. So the whole thing exploded at the brand new high-profile Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. They had proudly put their collection of Dead Sea Scroll fragments on display, but almost immediately, scholars started whispering something wasn't right. The museum eventually funded its own investigation, and in 2020, the report came out, and it was a bombshell. The verdict? Every single one of their fragments was a fake. We're talking about 16 different fragments. 16! The museum had spent millions of dollars on them, believing they were the real deal. Turns out they were all part of this huge wave of incredibly sophisticated forgeries that had been flooding the private market for years. So you're probably wondering, how on earth do you even fake something like this? And how did they get caught? Well, the forgers were smart. First, they got their hands on genuinely ancient leather, but it wasn't the right kind. It might have been from like an old Roman shoe or something. Then they coated it with this sticky, amber-colored glue to make it look old and shiny like the real scrolls. But here's the fatal mistake. When investigators looked under a microscope, they saw that the ink had bled and pooled into the existing cracks in the old leather. That's the smoking gun. It proved the writing was added thousands of years later. This whole forgery mess is actually a perfect window into a much bigger fight that's been going on in biblical archaeology for decades. It really all boils down to two completely different philosophies, two different ways of even thinking about the evidence. So on one side of the ring, you've got a group you could call biblical Maximalists. Now, their starting point is to treat the Bible as a generally reliable historical source. They don't necessarily take every single word literally, but they believe it's talking about real people, real places, and real events. For them, it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. And in the other corner, you have the biblical Minimalists. They come at this from the complete opposite direction. They're way more skeptical. For them, the Bible is a work of theology and literature first, not a history book. Their approach is basically prove it. Any historical claim in the Bible has to be independently verified by hard archaeological evidence. And this table really lays out the divide perfectly. Just look at the starting point. That's everything. A maximalist basically says, okay, the story is probably true unless the evidence proves it's not. A minimalist says, nope, the story is probably fiction unless the evidence proves it's true. And that fundamental difference leads to completely opposite conclusions about something like ancient Israel. Was it a real kingdom like in the Bible, or was it a story invented much, much later? And trust me, this isn't just some stuffy academic debate. No way. It gets very real very fast every time a new artifact gets pulled out of the ground. Let me show you a perfect example of how even a supposed smoking gun is never as simple as it seems. So let's go back to 1993. Archaeologists are digging at a site called Tel Dan in northern Israel, and they find these broken pieces of a stone monument. It's from the 9th century BCE, and what they read on it seems to be the first ever concrete proof of one of the Bible's most famous kings. Because right there, carved in the stone, is the phrase Beit David, the house of David. I mean, this was absolutely massive. It was the first time King David's dynasty had ever been mentioned outside of the Bible. For Maximalists, it was vindication. See, we told you he was real. For many minimalists, who had long argued David was a myth, well, this was a major problem. But, you knew there was a but coming, right? The story is never that clean. Decades passed, technology got a whole lot better, and a new generation of researchers took a fresh look at this famous stone, and they started asking a pretty radical question. It really came down to a kind of ancient forensic handwriting analysis. Using incredible high-tech imaging, they found that the way the letters were carved on the different fragments didn't quite match. Look here at the letter bet. On one piece, it's a smooth curve. On the other, it's two straight lines. It's subtle, but it's a huge tell. It suggests these pieces might not actually belong together. Now, this doesn't erase the phrase House of David, but it complicates the picture, and it's a perfect reminder that science is constantly re-examining the evidence. So where does all this leave us? We've got these breathtaking discoveries, these shocking forgeries, these deep, passionate debates. What does it all really tell us about our search for the past? Well, I think the biggest takeaway here is that archaeology isn't some simple tool you use to prove or disprove the Bible. It just doesn't work like that. Its real value is the rich context it gives us. It paints this incredibly detailed picture of what life was actually like back then. It shows us that history isn't a single, fixed story written in stone. It's a living, breathing thing that we're constantly piecing together. The goal isn't a final verdict, but a richer, deeper, and, more complicated understanding. So I'll leave you with this question to chew on. Does all this digging in the dirt challenge our beliefs? Or maybe, does it do something more profound? Does it reveal a past that is far more complex, more messy, and ultimately far more human than we ever imagined? Thanks for digging in with me on this one.